Hi, everyone. William Solomon here. Welcome to Beyond the Pill with Dr. Will. Today, I'm really excited to have with us Dr. Kelly Krogh. Kelly Krogh is a director on the migraine field medical team at Pfizer. He has a bachelor's in pharmaceutical sciences from Drake University, a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Minnesota, and he completed postdoctoral fellowships at both Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts General Hospital, and the Broad Institute of MIT at Harvard. Additionally, Kelly is pursuing an MBA from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. And Kelly actually has over 17 years of experience in pharmacology, neurology, and the neurosciences, with over 7 years working within medical affairs. So Kelly really is a seasoned industry executive. Really excited to have him here today. Welcome, Kelly.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, William. Appreciate you guys inviting me to be here. Look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for being here. We're excited. One of the things that we do here at Beyond the Pill with Dr. Will is we talk to industry executives like you who work in the pharma, life sciences, healthcare space to learn more about what's happening in this space and, to help also inform others that are out there, either if they're in the industry or want to be in the industry, to kind of understand the different career paths that many folks just like yourself, Kelly, have taken. So why don't we start there, Kelly? Tell us a little bit about your journey, so to speak, into the pharmaceutical industry. What led you to kind of go into the scientific space, and how did you end up working for the pharmaceutical industry?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I currently work for Pfizer, and so today, just get it out of the way up front. The views that I express today are my personal views and don't necessarily reflect those of Pfizer. But I have been in the industry now for 7 years, but in healthcare related focuses for the past 17. I think the things that drew me to healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry, there's quite a few. But primarily, I think first was the intellectual challenge. I like doing things that are hard because they tend to be worthwhile and they instill that sense of purpose and you're doing something that's meaningful. And so being able to participate in complex problem solving, continuous learning, staying up to date on the latest and the greatest as it relates to science and medicine that might benefit people, it really drew me in very early on. And in fact, my very first position in research was during my undergraduate days at Drake University, where I was working on a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease. So I was, thrust into healthcare and the pharmaceutical sort of aspect of this very, very early on. Other things that led me to pharmaceutical industry and industries in healthcare or pursuing healthcare is, I think, finding purpose in what you do is meaningful. It makes for a life well spent, and I couldn't think of a more meaningful or purposeful thing to do than helping other people who are suffering with illnesses. And so I know both personal experience and professional experience, there's a lot of unmet needs that exist out there for people who have illnesses. And so I've been drawn to do whatever I can to help. I have personal experience with family members who have dementia and neurodegeneration. And so I've got a soft spot in my heart for that. And I've been doing that for a long time and staying
Sure.
in neurology and neurosciences. But also regarding healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry, I think there's in my perspective way back in 2006, I was looking at what jobs might be most needed moving forward for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And it seemed like healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry was going to continue to grow and continue to bring value for a lot of those unmet needs in therapeutic areas that didn't have treatment. So there's many reasons why I pursued healthcare in the pharmaceutical industry, but ultimately I think the challenge that it brings intellectually, the ability to help other people, and the ability to grow over the course of my career, I think are some compelling reasons why I've done so.
That's fantastic, Kelly. And how do you see in the last few years that you've been in the industry? You've obviously had a tremendous amount of experience. How has the industry changed? How has the landscape changed, in your mind, within whether it's pharma in general or just kind of even within medical affairs specifically?
Yeah, I think in general, regarding the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, COVID highlighted a couple things about being able to bring treatments quickly to bring value to people that are suffering. So I think there was a spotlight placed on the industry in the early 2020s regarding COVID. So I think a lot of people recognize that the pharmaceutical industry can bring a lot of value and they can bring relief rapidly. And I think at that period of time, it was very fast development of treatment options and analysis of data and all of the things that go along with it. So I have seen more of a focus on the pharmaceutical industry as being a partner and less of a commercial entity trying to, sell medicine. I've met with people across this region here in the Upper Midwest. I live in Minnesota, and they've mentioned that they view us more so as a partner now than they have historically. Because when we meet with them, it's more about sharing data, answering questions, and bringing value and less about anything else. And so they appreciate that they're now viewing us more as a partner that brings value and less as a transaction
Right.
to participate in. But in addition to being having a greater role and responsibility globally, I think other things that I've noticed is the advancement of things like digital detection tools and artificial intelligence are becoming at the forefront of where the industry is now and where it might go in the future. And there's, Harvard Business Review articles on this topic, and there's publications elsewhere. But it does seem like there's notable potential moving forward of how the industry will continue to evolve and change with the introduction of artificial intelligence and these digital detection and monitoring tools. So there's lots of changes, but ultimately, I think being a partner, being respected, and doing so responsibly, I think is something that we should take seriously and do our best to be a good partner moving forward.
So you touched on an interesting area. We actually just did a webinar on this week, which is on artificial intelligence in the pharmaceutical industry. It's like the latest craze, right? All industries now want to get into AI, want to use AI. ChatGPT exploded about a year ago, and since then, people are excited. How can I use this in my company? I can use this in my day to day to make things more streamlined. I'm curious from the pharma industry standpoint, is there some concern or trepidation around how to use AI responsibly? And I bring this up because at the ACMA, the company that I run, we work with about 200 pharmaceutical companies, and many pharmaceutical companies, what I've found, they are still unsure. Many don't even have really policies in place for how to actually use AI properly, compliantly. What are you seeing? Where does the industry believe AI can really have good use and good application in terms of helping ultimately to bring drugs more responsibly to the market, whether it's to help build better relationships, help educate physicians? I'm just curious from your perspective, where do you see the greatest benefit with AI?
Sure. So it's a great topic. It is timely. There is a lot of focus on it. I've got a personal story from earlier this year with ChatGPT. It was in my MBA program. It was a marketing course. I had never used ChatGPT. So for 10 weeks, my small team and I, 4 or 5 of us, put together a marketing plan for our assignment. And it did take 10 weeks and 5 people to do a good job on this. And we thought we did a good job. So we submitted our assignment to the professor. And in the very next class, he says, okay, now I want you guys to go to ChatGPT. I want you to give just bare bones information about your market segment, about your, what you hope to accomplish and this and that. And then I want you to tell ChatGPT, write me a marketing plan. So what took me and 4 of my colleagues 10 weeks to do took ChatGPT 6 seconds. And
Wow.
it did a better job than us, which simultaneously made me mad because I was like, I'm being, outgunned here by a digital overlord, so to speak. But then I also felt empowered because it was at my disposal. I could use it as I see fit. And so since then, I've been making use of ChatGPT for a lot of different things. Like if I'm trying to think of what are the top 10 ways to accomplish this goal or to do this or that, it's a great place to go and sort of think of ideas and generate maybe some potential paths forward and select what's most relevant. But to your question about AI in the industry, it is at the forefront of many organizations. And I think the potential is limitless as I see it right now, but the reality may change over time. And so I think the areas where it may be useful moving forward, if it's reliable and trustworthy and accurate and efficient, is first and foremost drug discovery and development. So you could imagine when you're screening molecules to try to identify a ligand of interest or a molecule of interest, that's cumbersome. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of attention. But the potential for AI to help screen that and to look for potential drug candidates, you could see it might be able to do that even faster. Like I said, what took my team and I 10 weeks took ChatGPT 6 seconds. So it may be able to screen candidates faster. Or alternatively, if you were looking for, which receptor is most relevant for a specific disease, it may be able to identify targets more effectively and efficiently. So first would be drug development and drug discovery. The second would then be, once you've identified a molecule or a target, it might be applicable in the context of clinical trial design and then clinical trial monitoring. So you could imagine clinical trial design can be somewhat of a cumbersome process. It can take time. It may not be as accurate as one would hope from time to time. But with, if AI is as trustworthy as we hope it's going to be, then maybe it could help inform clinical trial design so that we get more value out of those clinical trials. And then maybe the clinical trials can be more efficient, both from a financial perspective, but a time perspective as well. Maybe they could be shorter and bring more value to the organization. Um, Regarding AI and its sort of uh, being applied now, it's not necessarily AI, but more on the digital detection tools. There is significant progress being made in an area called ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, where many bright scientists and clinicians have developed tools that are on smartwatches or on smartphones, and they allow real-time monitoring of people in their natural environment, not a clinic setting or a hospital setting, but when they're out and about. And rather than having snapshots of data over time like you would get in a clinical trial, ecological momentary assessment allows people to get a stream of data. So you see all of the data all of the time, which may be more valuable when trying to figure out, real world applicability or effectiveness of treatment. So I think ecological momentary assessment is gaining a foothold. AI for drug development and clinical trial monitoring and design could be useful. But then beyond that, I think getting in the realm of medical affairs specifically, there are some publications out there that look at the use of AI and natural language processing to help answer questions for clinicians in real time, send those standard response documents for those who are requesting them. AI has been considered an option when writing those documents, is considered an option for when creating slide decks to make those slide decks more accurate, more informative, and more engaging. And I know they've even considered using AI when you're making educational tools like little video snippets or anything that a customer may interact with. That AI is thought that it might be useful moving forward. But having said all that, that's sort of pie in the sky. What could happen? I think that as things evolve, we'll have to gain a better understanding of, is this what we want? Are we more efficient? Are we more accurate? Are we bringing more value to the customers and the patients? And if so, I think it'll be a step in the right direction. But I've yet to see it applied in the real world setting yet. So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen.
No, I think those are all important points. You touched on something earlier around, the change that COVID brought, and it got me to thinking about access to
Mm,
physicians or other healthcare providers. Obviously, if for those that are out there listening that aren't familiar with the pharmaceutical industry field team, so if you're working when we say field medical or a medical science liaison team, these are the folks that typically have advanced degrees and they're going out there educating really the top notch physicians and healthcare providers in the country. We call them key opinion leaders within the industry. But what I've heard from many of my industry colleagues is that access has been tough over the last 2 to 3 years. And physicians, they just want the information given to them, maybe digitally. I mean, and maybe that's an opportunity for AI, kind of like you alluded to. But what are you seeing, I guess, on your end, right? You're with a big company, right? Pfizer's a very well-known organization. So what are you guys seeing in terms of access? Like where's that? How's that looking, I guess, with KOLs nowadays? Is it more difficult to access them?
I think for the field in general, I've seen data to suggest that some clinicians prefer that virtual interaction still, others want to go back to face to face. For me personally, they prefer face to face generally. And I've noticed that the virtual, meeting with them, it tends to be more efficient but less impactful. And then the face to face tends to be much less efficient but much more impactful. And so I do think that a lot of the clinicians, they like that face-to-face interaction. I think face-to-face helps to build trust. And if they trust the MSL with whom they're working, then, the relationship can get off and running and they can trust the content that's coming in. So for me specifically, I've seen kind of a split camp. Some people want to remain virtual, other people prefer face to face. But across the board, regardless, I do see a continued demand for wanting interactions with the MSL amongst the clinicians. And it makes sense because since 10 years ago, there are 75% more assets per indication than there were, just 10 years ago. And so
Wow.
there's a lot more medicine available. There's significantly more data available. I read a statistic yesterday that there's in the past 2 years we have created more data, on Earth regarding science and medicine than we had in the prior 100 years. And so the amount of data that's available it's huge. The amount of medicines that are available, there are many more than there used to be, and the data is getting more complicated. And so
Yeah.
clinicians still have that limited amount of time frame that they need to get this information, learn it, and be able to apply it. And so I still think they see value in meeting with us because ultimately we save them time, get them information that's relevant to the work that they're doing clinically, and they tend to appreciate that. So I guess ultimately access did see a little bump, but people still prefer that face to face or at least virtual interactions.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, because I've seen mixed data, especially for younger clinicians. They're more comfortable with digital interactions. They're not necessarily, it's not that important to them to have the face to face, but that's good to hear because I do agree. I think having the face to face interaction is really important. So absolutely, I agree with you. And you mentioned something that, struck a chord with me about the scientific data that's out there is more than it's ever been. You said in the last 100 years. And I remember actually seeing a publication on this a few years ago where the curve, I mean, the increase, especially post-industrial revolution, just skyrocketed. There's an exponential increase. And I think that ultimately creates a situation where if you're in the pharma industry, you're in medical affairs, you're a medical science liaison, you really need to have a much greater skill set because the information that is available, it's readily available, right? If you think about it in human history, we've never really been in a situation up until really the advent of the internet and Google where access to information is ubiquitously available to everybody.
Mhm.
There really wasn't that wasn't the case, even just 20, 30 years ago. So I see that you have BCMAS in your title. And one of the things from my perspective, the value of getting board certified in medical affairs is it gives you that broader skill set. So I'm just curious from your standpoint, you're obviously very well trained, very well accomplished academically. What kind of prompted you and made you say, you know what, I want to get board certified in medical affairs?
Sure. So, first of all, thanks for the service and the skills that I've gained. I got it from you guys like around 5 years ago, and I got my BCMAS. I'm literally recertifying now because I think my BCMAS expires at the end of this month. So I just re
Right.
up and we'll get that done. But the reason I initially did it, it was among my first jobs. It was my first job in industry, and I wanted to do a couple of things. One, I wanted to establish credibility within my organization because everybody on the team at that time had a D degree of some sort, PharmD, MD, PhD. But I wanted to demonstrate that while I may be new to medical affairs, that I was committed to the role, and I wanted to establish that credibility, and I did so through getting the BCMAS certification. In addition to credibility amongst peers, I also wanted broader recognition beyond just my peer group at that company. Is I wanted industry recognition. So imagining if I didn't stay at that company forever, that if I ever went out to pursue new opportunities, that when they looked at me as a job candidate, I may stand out and be recognized because in addition to a D degree, I've also got a board certification in medical affairs, which may help to increase that recognition and provide a bit of a competitive edge. And on that competitive edge piece, I know that there's a lot of talented, smart, hardworking, amazing people that are being drawn to medical affairs now. So the competition is getting more and more fierce, and being able to differentiate yourself from other potential job candidates, I think, is becoming more important. And so I did that early on. I'm doing it again because it's becoming even more competitive.
Yeah.
And then in addition to those things, I did also want to improve my skill set. It was my first job in industry. I knew there was a lot that I needed to learn, and the BCMAS helped me expedite that learning and learn a lot of different things that I wouldn't have otherwise learned. And so it helped me enhance the skills that I had. Also, it provided an interesting networking opportunity because I've noticed now people will reach out to me on LinkedIn or other websites, and they'll say something to the effect of, "I see you have your BCMAS. Can we meet for 10 or 15 minutes? I'd like to learn more about it." And that's happened probably 15 or 20 times since I've got the BCMAS
Oh,
certification.
wow.
And so it allows me to, talk to potential BCMAS people and let them know, was it worth it? Would I do it again? What was good? What value might it bring to their condition? And I always sing the praises and I say, it's worth your time, it's worth your energy, it's something to consider. I'm going to do it again when I have to recertify. And then ultimately, lastly, is continuing education in medical affairs you can kind of get from many different places. But with BCMAS, I looked at the people that were part of the organization, people who designed the curriculum. Some of them I knew personally, and because I knew them and I respected them, I thought, well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And so that's another reason why I selected it, is because it was a reputable source of information.
Yeah, and I mean, all the things that you were saying earlier around AI and all the different applications, not just with AI tools, but just digital tools in general, and some of the things that we were talking about in terms of even being able to access physicians and to understand different therapeutic areas and have that broader skill set. I think that's where having a credential and standards really makes a difference. So, I mean, from my perspective, of course, I believe it's so important. So I completely agree with you. In terms of some of the trends that you're seeing, you mentioned again earlier on that there's been this explosion of data just worldwide. And again, we see that. But in terms of trends that you're seeing in general within healthcare, what would you say are some of the two or three emerging trends that you're seeing in healthcare that, if you're working in the industry, if you're working in healthcare, you really should be aware of? I mean, one example that comes to mind is like big data and
Mhm.
everything that's going on with the mining of big data. But what are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of when you talk to your physicians, when you go work with these different healthcare systems? What are some of those emerging trends that you're seeing?
So I think the first is well, it's two. They're all two, the two related around value. One is the economic value, and the other one is the clinical value. So in terms
Mhm.
of like economic value, I was at the American Academy of Neurology earlier this year, and they had a session on projects that clinicians and academic medical centers may participate in to essentially demonstrate the value of what they're doing. And so one of the people who was speaking said that it used to be nice to have that these projects would be done to demonstrate value, and nowadays it's a have to have. You
So I have
must
to have.
be able to demonstrate if you want to pursue something that you know uh, patient satisfaction scores are going up, or operational efficiency is improving, or cost to the firm is going down. And so I think being able to demonstrate that there is an economic benefit to whatever you're deciding to do in healthcare, I think went from a nice to have maybe 10 years ago, and it sounds like from the experts that now it's a have to have.
Mm.
So beyond that economic value, of course, there's the clinical value. And as I mentioned before, there's something like 75% more assets per indication for medicines these days. So there's lots of options out there. And a lot of clinicians are wondering, why would I select option one versus option two? So being able to effectively and clearly describe the clinical value to a clinician, I think, is something that's changed, just because there are more things available and they're having to decide between option one, two, three, and maybe even option four. So economic value is big, clinical value is big, but I think to your point about big data, I think the underlying foundation of all of this, it comes from the fact that many of these clinicians and healthcare systems know that the data exists, and rather than make decisions based on feelings or something other than data, they want to see a data-driven approach to answer questions to help make their organization more efficient, more effective, and get better patient outcomes. And I think that's where the field may be heading, is using that data, maybe with AI or through other methods, to help inform big decisions, but even like day-to-day decisions. I think people are looking for. So ultimately, I see more value being placed on the economic story, the clinical story, and then also, can we get access to the data to answer questions about perhaps our own healthcare system, so that we can make the best decision moving forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, cost effectiveness data is really big, and you're talking about really this issue of pharmacoeconomics, and ultimately, is the drug worth the cost? Just I'll share a personal story. So a few years ago, my mother had gliosarcoma. She was diagnosed with. So for those that don't know, it's a very rare form of an aggressive brain cancer, and she passed away. Within about 6 months of diagnosis, but one of the things that I remember she was presented with was this option of being in a clinical trial and working with, this group out in DC who was experimenting with a therapy that was still in, under clinical trial investigation, hadn't been approved yet. And in that situation, the question was that we asked as a family was, okay, if she does enroll in the study, what are the side effects? And I mean, they were gonna take on the cost, but here's the key: what would she gain? The answer to that question was from the clinicians was that she might gain 2 or 3 months of additional survival. However, the quality of life could be pretty poor.
Mm-hmm.
In her situation, and she was 64 when she passed away at the time, she opted to say, you know what, I don't want to enroll in a clinical trial. I don't want to be involved in taking an experimental drug. I'd rather just, kind of live my last days with a better quality of life, even if it's shorter versus the additional 2 to 3 months being in and out of hospitals and whatnot. And I bring that point up because I think especially in areas like that, like in oncology, for example, that's the question, right? It's like, if you're a healthcare system or you're a payer, right? Do you cover that cost? Is it worth the additional 2 or 3 months of survival? And it's not a clear cut question, right? For someone like my mother, it wasn't worth it, right? But for another patient, if you're younger, if you have young children, let's say, for example, it might be worth it. The risk might be worth it. Versus, let's say, if you're older and you feel like, you know what, I don't want to take that risk. So it's a very much an individual decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we talk about economics of medicine, economics of not just, therapeutic interventions, but even like services, medical services and things like that, surgeries and whatnot, the question becomes, what are you gaining for what you're spending for that cost?
Mm-hmm.
What are you really getting at? And it reminds me, as I used to work when I was in the pharmaceutical industry, I worked in the area of cardiovascular disease quite a bit. And at that time, this is going back probably in the early to mid 2000s. There was a lot of question about, if you did a procedure, in terms of interventional cardiology, you stented someone that didn't have any previous event. They didn't have a previous, MI, myocardial infarction or heart attack, or a previous stroke. Would there be a benefit, like a mortality benefit? And the study came in and found that the answer was no. So there was no benefit, even though you were stenting these patients. There was only a benefit on their mortality and morbidity if they had had the event. So if you had what we call, in cardiovascular disease, secondary prevention, in that situation, then yes, there was a benefit with stenting. But in primary prevention patients, there wasn't. It was your outcomes were just as good as if you took, sublingual nitroglycerin, let's say, for your angina. And that caused a big uproar, right, among the cardiology community because their bread and butter was doing procedures. But the question was, what am I gaining for what I'm spending, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's the patient? So this is a really big issue right now, is this issue of, what is the cost effectiveness? What is the lifetime value of that procedure, of that therapeutic intervention and whatnot? So I mean, I think you're absolutely right. This is one of the biggest things that we see. One of the areas that the ACMA works in is prior authorization. So we actually have a certification for prior authorization, and we support a lot of organizations who are looking to help augment their prior authorization services in terms of like doing prior authorization submissions. And it's skyrocketed. And one of the reasons is there's more expensive drugs in the market. There's more specialty products, biologics, et cetera. And so the payers are pushing back and saying, is this really worth paying for or not? So I think that's going to be a whole new, discussion that's going to come down the pike. I know there's been some, discussions within Congress in terms of passing some legislation to look at PBMs and the role that PBMs play. So we'll have to see where that goes. But as you and I both know, drug pricing has always been a major issue in the pharmaceutical industry. I'm going to ask you one last question that I'm really interested to hear kind of your perspective on, and that's specifically in medical affairs. And as you and I know, I worked in the industry for about 15 years. One of the biggest things was always, how does medical affairs demonstrate its value,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's still, I think, when I talk to people, at least a big obstacle. And I just want to hear your perspective. How does medical affairs overcome this obstacle?
Well, before we get to that, I'm sorry to hear about your mother, and thank you for
Thank
sharing
you.
the story with me. It's got to be tough. But to your question about medical affairs and obstacles, it's a great question. It's the never-ending battle, it seems, of how do you demonstrate your value. to senior leadership. And I think if I break it down, there's probably a few areas that are obstacles that many in medical affairs, they find difficult doing, or perhaps are in the way of demonstrating their value to senior leadership. The first is probably measuring impact. And so if you think about historically, how do you quantify the impact of what you did? So let's say I meet with a clinician, they ask some questions about some data, I share the data, but then the question is, well, and then what? What impact did that have?
Right.
Any? And it's hard to quantify. And so I think if organizations are able to effectively quantify that impact, that removes a bit of a barrier because it allows management and team leaders to then talk to senior leadership and say, this is the impact. These are the ripples that we've had within certain health systems, and this is the downstream sequelae of meeting with our field medical teams. I've worked with organizations that did not have any focus on impact, and I've worked for other organizations that put a very high emphasis on impact. And I tend to favor the impact side because it allows for a more compelling story to be told. Because if you have meeting metrics, let's say you meet 30 people a month, that's nice. That's what lots of people do, is they say, oh, we met with lots of people, therefore we must have been having an impact. But that may not be the case. If you can actually point to something that you did that was an impact of the interaction that you had, and you could effectively quantify it to any degree, I think that would allow your management team to explain to senior leadership, this is what we're doing and this is why it matters. So first is probably impact. The second is metrics, and metrics are everywhere. But I think the problem comes with the lack of standardization of metrics. So if you go from company one, they might want you to meet with, I don't know, 60 people a month. And then company two says we don't do metrics. Then company three says we want 30 meetings a month. So the metrics are sort of all over the place, and it's difficult to benchmark performance of medical affair teams across different companies because we're all measured by different measurement systems, whether it be 60, 0, or 30 interactions and then impacts and all that stuff. So I think lack of standard metrics is a challenge to explain the value of the organization. I think another area is aligning objectives. So I've been in organizations where medical affairs seem to exist in a silo, and it didn't interact often enough with other parts of the organization to really bring out the most value that it might bring. But I've also worked in places where there's lots of cross-functional partnering going on, and I think for the organizations to be most successful and to really gain and sustain a competitive advantage, I think there needs to be an alignment of objectives between medical and other parts of the organization so that everybody is sort of rowing the boat in the same direction in a compliant way, of course. But it makes no sense if I'm rowing against a cross-functional partner. We just don't know we're rowing against one another. It makes no sense from the
Right.
perspective of the entire organization. And so, getting those objectives aligned, I think, would allow being able to display the value of medical affairs more effectively because you're working more effectively with your cross-functional partners. And then lastly, I think obstacles for people in medical affairs are resource constraints. So there's a recent white paper by McKinsey and Company that speculates where medical affairs may be by 2030. And they had an interesting statistic in there, which was that in the past 5 years, budgets for medical affairs has remained flat, but then relative to revenue has actually gone down 20%. And so revenues or budgets are either flat or going down, depending on how you look at it. But McKinsey and colleagues make the argument that if we really want to maximize the value of medical affairs and remove those obstacles, that budgets would likely need to increase so that we can adapt with the changing times of AI and the new digital detection and tools that are available to us. But essentially, I think with limited resources, it's difficult to demonstrate your value because you may not have everything that you need to go do the job that you've been hired to do. So I think ultimately it comes down to impact, metrics, aligning objectives, and then resources.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd love to go to the next medical affairs meeting and that not be a topic. That's that topic of, how to demonstrate value. I think you hit all the important points. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think it was very well said. And, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm a huge advocate for medical affairs. And, for any of the folks that are in leadership positions listening to this podcast, Remember that when you're setting your budgets for the following year, medical affairs really needs that support. They really can bring a tremendous amount of value. One statistic that I'll leave everyone with is the average field medical person, the average medical science liaison gets on average about 25 times the amount of interaction with a healthcare provider that a sales representative does. So I think sales plays an important role, but medical equally, I would say, plays a very, very important role. All right. Well, with that, Kelly, I want to thank you for coming on today's podcast. It was really great getting to know you and getting to learn more about the important work that you do. And for all those out there that are listening, thanks again for listening. You can check us out on our YouTube page, follow us, like, comment, reach out with other topics that you're interested in hearing more about. All right. Thank you guys.
Thanks, William. Thanks, everybody.